Hello students, this is Professor Chulai, and in this video we're going to look at classifying matter. Now so far we've talked about how chemistry is the study of matter and that matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. However, in order to study chemistry in more detail, we need to classify matter into different forms. Now you can follow along with me using our chapter worksheet, and let's look at this simple sort of flowchart that separates matter into its different classes, if you will. So let's look at the right hand side first. So if the matter has constant properties and composition, we call that matter a pure substance. So for a definition, a pure substance has constant composition. Okay, so it has constant properties and composition. An example of this might be water. If you have a glass of water and you zoom into the atomic level at different parts of this sample, you'd find the same things, H2O molecules. However, if those the things that make up a pure substance can be simplified further, we call that a compound. So for example, in the case of water, we can separate that further into hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms. So this would be a compound. So a compound, the definition is a pure substance that can be broken down by chemical changes. On the other hand, if your pure substance cannot be broken down by chemical changes into any simpler compound, into any simpler materials, we're going to call that an element. So an element is any pure substance that cannot be broken down by chemical changes. And we're going to look at what chemical changes mean in the next video. But for example, let's say you have a piece of metal made up of iron. It's a pure substance because no matter where you look at in this iron, you'll find iron atoms. However, you cannot break the iron atoms down into any simpler form using chemical processes or chemical changes. And so iron is an example, iron metal is an example of an element. Okay, now let's look at the left-hand side of this flowchart, where the material or the substance does not have constant composition or properties, meaning it changes from point to point. An example for this would be, let's say, concrete. If you were to zoom in different parts of concrete, even though it looks like it's made up of the same consistent thing throughout, you might zoom in and find, for example, sand at one point if you zoom into the atomic level, whereas at another point you might find, I don't know, little stones with different composition, different atoms. So that's an example of a mixture. So a mixture, the definition is something that is composed of two or more types of matter. And it can be separated, these types of matter can be separated by physical changes. Again, we're going to look at what physical changes and chemical changes are in the next video. Okay, so with mixtures, there are two types that you may have heard of, homogeneous mixtures and heterogeneous mixtures. And these are determined by whether or not the mixture that we're looking at is uniformed throughout. So if it is uniformed throughout, it has the same makeup throughout, it's called a homogeneous mixture. And if it's not the same throughout, we call it a heterogeneous mixture. So our definitions here, there we go. Heterogeneous mixtures is a mixture with a composition that varies from point to point. An example would be like concrete that we mentioned earlier. It's mixture, it's made up of many different things, and if you look at different parts of that mixture, you'll have very different makeup of its atoms. Whereas a homogeneous mixture, we sometimes call a homogeneous mixture a solution, and that is just a mixture with a composition that is the same or uniform throughout. An example would be a sugary drink, for example. No matter where you look at in that little sugary drink mixture, you should find the same compositions of water, sugar, and food coloring, which is pretty much all that's in sugary drinks these days. Doesn't matter where you look at it, you'll find the same makeup. It doesn't vary from region to region. So this is a homogeneous mixture or a solution. So those are the ways that we can classify matter. Matter can either be a mixture or a pure substance. Mixtures can either be heterogeneous or homogeneous, and pure substances can either be elements or compounds. All right, so I'd like you to pause here and try to answer questions 4, 5, and 6. And when we come back, we'll go over some examples. When you think you have an answer, you can unpause and we'll go over some answers for them. Okay, so question number 4 asks, what is an example of something made up of only one kind of atom? And this is an example of a what? So I mentioned iron earlier as something made up of only one kind of atom, and that is an example of an element. Can we think of something else that's made up of only one kind of atom? Well, oxygen that we need to survive, it has formula O2, but it only has one type of atom. That means it's an element. Water is an example of what, according to these classifications? Well, we talked about how water is a pure substance because no matter where you look, you'll find the same collection of water molecules and nothing else. However, those water molecules made up of H2O can be broken down chemically into simpler things, so water is a compound. And finally, for homogeneous and heterogeneous mixtures, we talked about how homogeneous mixtures are solutions, and so you can think of any number of solutions, salt solutions, sugar solutions. Air is another example of a homogeneous mixture. For the most part, air at the surface of the earth, it's a mixture that's uniformed throughout of mostly nitrogen and oxygen gases. Whereas heterogeneous mixtures are any mixtures of things that are not consistent throughout. I mentioned concrete, but really any solid and solid mixtures would be heterogeneous. Okay, that brings us to the end of this lecture. In this lecture, we talked about the classifications of matter into mixtures and pure substances. Mixtures can be homogeneous or heterogeneous, and pure substances can be elements or compounds. I will see you in the next video where we'll talk about physical and chemical changes.